Hi, hello everyone, and welcome back to our second session. So, our next presenter, Darya Pilram, is a senior researcher for Twitter. She spends most of her day trying to understand why and how groups harness technology to spread harmful narratives. Darya will share some examples that illustrate the ongoing harm, both on and offline, caused when conspiracy theories and dangerous group affiliations meet. Fun fact, Daria became a certified pilot to overcome a fear of flying. Cool. Over to you, Daria.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. It's only my second time ever public speaking, so this is an exciting opportunity for me, and I really wish I could have come to New Zealand for this one. Slightly different. I won't be talking much about conspiracy theories, but I will be talking about the landscape of frontline research and sharing some of my experiences with you. I'm excited to have you along for the ride. I still remember my first near-death experience at work. It was a bright and sunny day at Forward Operating Base Tagab in the Alisay Valley in eastern Afghanistan. I was playing cards with the guys, and I heard what sounded like rain on the tin roof over our heads, except it was bright and sunny, and it turns out the rain was actually bullets flying over the nearby perimeter fence. A few moments later, the guys were pushing over our table and making a little barricade, and the other guys were running towards the wall with their rifles. Someone picked me up and shoved me back towards my room and threw the Kevlar body armor at me that I kept by the door. The last thing I heard was to get under the bed with my weapon pointed at the door. I was advised, under no circumstances, to open the door, and that if the door did open before a ceasefire, I was to shoot. So, why was I here? How much research can you do from a place like this? And why would anyone choose to do this? The answer for me comes from Albert Einstein. He once said that the problems we've created in the world today will not be solved by the level of thinking that created them. My way of getting closer to the type of thinking we need to be doing is to go directly to the source. After all of these experiences, I've come up with a definition for how I think about frontline research. I think that frontline research is getting as close as you can to uncovering and confronting really hard truths. So you might be asking, who is this girl? Well, I was trained formally in anthropology, and I grew up with a very deep fascination for what people do and why they do it. I had a really fortuitous internship at the White House that opened up some pretty extensive doors. And I had the benefit of a natural, inherent sense of curiosity and adventure that led to a wild series of deliberate and sometimes not so deliberate frontline research experiences. The talk I'm going to give today is a snapshot of some of these experiences, how I experienced the front line, and some of the things that, in reflection, I've learned and applied along the way. What this isn't is an exhaustive description of all of my experiences. Here are the three lessons I learned, and maybe some of them will be familiar to you. One, bring them with you. You need to bring folks with you in a variety of different ways. Two, you need to build a team of teams. This is particularly important when you're dealing with seriously thorny and complex issues that no one solution could possibly solve. And three, I don't know if this is advice or a warning, but be ready to face some seriously uncomfortable truths. So let's get started. The first lesson I learned, bring them with you, came from my experience in 2013 in Afghanistan. I was part of a special unit with the US Army of Social Scientists, and I was deployed with a group of Army Special Operations Forces to make sense of a deeply complex space and to advise how and why we should engage with different facets of the population. Most of my reporting was trying to convey deeply complex histories and problems and fit them into short bullet points for the daily presentations to the Army command staff. I gained a reputation pretty quickly for pointing out faulty assumptions, biases, and for always asking why. Why are we doing this? Why now? And for underscoring what I considered relatively obvious unintended consequences in some of the planned operations. The longer I was out there on that particular front line, the more difficult I found it to declare definitively that someone was good or bad. But I realized that the military groups I was embedded with were trained to see things in black and white. It made making decisions a lot easier. And adding dimensions to that binary became my biggest source of frustration and my single most important mission. A mentor of mine once said that if I could turn frustration into fascination, I could move from reacting to responding. It was a way to quickly spark curiosity in a frustrating situation, and I decided the only way to improve the questions that were being asked of me was to deepen our learning together and share this burden of knowledge and asking better questions. The problem I was facing was that everybody wanted and expected answers in black and white. Should we do this or that? And if I do that, do I get this outcome or not? And many of the military teams also frequently rotated in and out of the area of operation, which means I was getting some of the similar initial questions over and over again. I realized that the only way to influence change would require bringing folks along with me. And so I did. I brought them right on into the field with me. I started planning operations that required different folks to embed with me on some of these interviews and to hear some of the complex answers we would get back after evaluating an operation. The other thing I did was I built a really cool library and a tea station in my office. And so on one side of the room, I pulled out all of the reports that were relevant to the most popular questions that I received. And then I set up a really fancy tea station and invited people in to have a cup of tea, do some deep learning on their own, and then strike up a conversation with me so we could go deeper. This led to deeper questions about disrupting parts of the system upstream. And more importantly, exploring really viable alternatives. It's hard though. These teams were like a hammer, and to them, everything looked like a nail. And so this learning happened over time. So that was my first lesson. Bring them with you. I think it's really important as a researcher and a designer to share in the learning process through experiences, not just presentations. It's also important to make what might feel like uncomfortable ambiguity more comfortable and fun for the people you want to bring with you. And finally, I think you should always try to encourage divergence before convergence. What I mean is, if someone comes to you with a solution, try to help them explore why that solution and why now, and see if you can get folks to diverge a little bit more. If you come up with a common set of why you're doing something, it opens up the space for exploring creative and alternative options. Well, this frontline experience kind of gave me a reputation. And so it wasn't long before I was on to my next frontline. I was headed to Mogadishu, Somalia. From 2016 to 2017, I was sent to Mogadishu as the first ever embedded counterterrorism programs coordinator. I was embedded this time with the embassy, not the military. And I had a really broad portfolio, but one of the core programs was to develop and understand and effectively monitor and evaluate a very specialized group of counterterrorism police officers. This is where I learned my second lesson, that sometimes you have to create a team of teams. So here's a quick, not very great photo. As you can imagine, it's not easy to take a photo of these guys. So my job seemed simple enough. Figure out what a counterterrorism policeman is supposed to do, figure out if they're trained and equipped to do that, and then evaluate how they're doing. Seemed simple enough. It wasn't long before we had our first car bombing. And during that car bombing, I followed the police out there to figure out exactly what they were supposed to be doing. You know, your typical user experience researcher. But what I realized is that in order to investigate this bombing, there were numerous steps involved. And more so, that these steps were actually like a giant puzzle, and different organizations, international entities like the UN, or actually separate countries owned each little piece of this puzzle. So while I was on the line to describe the effectiveness of the police force, a lot of the tools and processes before and after an incident weren't owned by my portfolio. And it was really hard to claim success with what resources I had. And without having control of those other resources. Worse, people were competing for these resources. So instead of working together to map this out, there was actually no incentive to align. And every little team had their individual hammer, their individual nail, and they were reporting success completely absent of the other pieces of the system. I realized what I needed to do was bring people together in the best way possible, at least as far as I knew. First, give people free food. Second, pull out all of your Post-it notes. And third, invite all of these diplomats and military officials to my own house to start writing on the wall. Now, after this experience, it was very clear to me that we were all finally thinking systematically. And again, this seems like a relatively simple solution for such a serious problem, but it made a huge difference. I knew that I had to go beyond tea with one person and really invite an entire group. Pizza was the unifying factor. And what it did was it enabled us to see the full spectrum of the problem, to identify shared outcomes and look for different gaps and obstacles and opportunities. One of which were things like timelines. So we have all the resources we need, but if my resources are arriving 6 months before yours, it doesn't really help us complete that cycle. Anyway, during this time, I learned very quickly that we can't do it alone. And by doing it together, we were able to better prioritize and to better match realistic timelines where we had found these dependencies. The other consideration here is by creating a team of teams, you also create cheerleaders for your work because they can report things that are happening ahead of their own programs or things that might happen as a result of the success of their individual programs. And this became a really powerful group of friends. I'm in touch with these people still years later. So anyway, this was lesson number 2, creating a team of teams. Again, gather stakeholders, as many as you can find, in a safe and fun space. I guarantee you, even the most stoic of military officials will smile when they see pizza and Post-it notes. Document all of the interests, resources, obstacles, and enablers. It's really important that part of the safety of the space is security for folks, but also that they feel it's a trusting environment to be really quite honest with what access they do or don't have to resources, and the real types of obstacle they face, even if it's personality based. And finally, co-create a shared problem and outcome space that helps to give everyone the grounding for their individual interests within this larger picture. Again, you will benefit from folks sharing what you're doing. They will evangelize it for you, and it's free advertising for your success and theirs. So finally, my parents, my family really wanted me to come in from some of these experiences, and they asked, well, isn't there a way you could apply what you're doing maybe to the tech realm? I'm from San Francisco. My whole family was in the Bay Area, and everyone really wanted me to find a way home. My twin sister was working at Uber at the time, and she said, I think we're expanding quite quickly, and there's been some very unique or interesting safety issues. I bet they would hire you to come work on those. So my third field experience that I'll share with you is about my time at Uber. This is where I really confronted for the first time in the private sector what it means to have uncomfortable truths and what some of the trade-offs are that I was not expecting coming out of the government realm. Also, and this is present with a lot of tech platforms, you have these singular solutions that with a click of the button are accessible to people all over the world, which makes for a very scalable set of unexpected problems. So coming in out of the conflict zones, I thought the days of being in the headlines might be over. Unfortunately, my first week at Uber saw us on the front pages of different newspapers every single day of my first 2 weeks. And I realized this was going to be a much harder topic than I had anticipated. People were getting hurt. Uber was in a major expansion mode, and this was inviting more diverse and more diverse markets and reports of more unique and unanticipated safety issues. I needed to figure out what was going on, and I did it the best way I knew how by going to the source directly in these markets, putting myself into these uncomfortable positions, and observing what was going on. Now, something I heard repeatedly came down to cash. So Uber had just made a big, bold bet on cash. When you look at this picture, what you see is a lot of demand and a lot of unique modes of transportation, all of which are being paid by cash. So Uber was evaluating new opportunities in markets based on how many people pay in cash, or um, how few is the how limited is the credit card um, uh, infiltration in those markets, if you will. So are people paying primarily in cash, and are there a lot of people who need to move to a lot of places? The answer was yes. So we started with India. After they saw success in India, they decided, well, let's launch in our next biggest market, Brazil. The problem is that the experience with cash in Brazil introduced a whole host of unanticipated and seriously dangerous problems. I also did research in Jakarta, Indonesia, and parts of South Africa, where we were seeing similar patterns and reports by both drivers and riders related to cash. So you might ask, what is so dangerous about cash? Well, it's not what you might think, not necessarily the cash itself. You see, the first thing that cash introduced was a level of anonymity that the platform was unaccustomed to. When you use credit cards, you benefit from the processes that a credit card company goes through to know your customer, and there's some level of baked in accountability. But with cash, it can be anonymous. When you remove that accountability, you open up the space to a host of creative ways to utilize this anonymity. And in certain markets, that took the form of criminal networks. Second, this one was probably the most unexpected. Cash was taking people to brand new geographic locations because the requests for rides from primarily cash markets came from um, outside of the city center. So, what you can see here, the left photo is in the middle of Cairo, right off the river, straight roads, lots of arteries. It's easy to navigate. The GPS works pretty well. The second photo shows where primarily cash-oriented trips were coming from. It's a maze of primarily homemade streets. When people build, they just add a little bit more to the street. And then the third picture shows an area, again, in the periphery in Colombia, where we had a lot of issues with cartel networks, but also you can see this picture demonstrates a one-way road. If you came into some trouble, it would be really hard to get out of here. And third, there were a lot of real and perceived dangers associated with who these cash riders were, which introduced a lot of issues of perception and bias and unfairness that had to be grappled with. Um, I discovered throughout this experience what an anthropologist, Elizabeth Colson, calls uncomfortable knowledge, or the discovery of knowledge that contradicts, threatens, or otherwise challenges established belief systems. Interview after interview lamented about cash, and I knew we had to go deeper. But also, cash was the biggest promise in the company, and so there were a lot of trade-offs that needed to be considered. So facing uncomfortable truths can be quite uncomfortable. First of all, I urge you to embrace the new identity. You may not be a researcher gatherer all the time. Sometimes you become the truth teller. It's important to highlight real experiences, acknowledge the hard trade offs, and in those real experiences, you might be surprised by the creative solutions that come out of it. And finally, recruit those new besties you've been making to evangelize these stories and help you gather opportunities that are grounded in the local context. Now, I started this talk with my first near death experience, and I can tell you it certainly hasn't been my last. My new manager once told me that sometimes the most influence we can have is creating a spark, and I think I've left some significant blazes in my wake. Yes, there are real dangers to conducting frontline research, but at the same time, the work is life affirming. There are incredible benefits, and I couldn't have learned and applied these insights if I hadn't been there. As researchers, we have this incredible opportunity to be in the world. And I want to urge you to consider that even the smallest actions can have a really large ripple effect. If you're interested in really meaningful work on the front line, but you're not ready or comfortable yet, I'd still really like to hear from you. I want to know, what's your front line? you can feel free to hit me up on Twitter or email or LinkedIn. Pick your poison. And thank you so much.